At the anniversary dinner, my daughter's father-in-law grabbed his steak and threw it straight into her face. "Did you forget your place in this house?" he said coldly. 50 guests went silent. My son-in-law just lowered his head and kept eating like nothing happened. I stood up, wiped the sauce from my daughter's face, and walked toward the man who humiliated her. What I did next made the entire room freeze and changed everything my family thought they knew. Before we go further, thank you for being here. Truly. Dad Family Revenge is built for people who understand that family loyalty cuts both ways. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from today? You might be surprised how many of us are sitting with the same feelings. Some elements of this story are fictional, added for depth and clarity. Names and settings are coincidental. The lesson, however, is one I hope stays with you. The house sat at the end of a private road in Bel Air, hidden behind iron gates and a row of Italian cypress trees, trimmed so perfectly they looked artificial. I had driven past neighborhoods like this 100 times in my 66 years in Southern California and never had reason to pull through a gate like that one. Tonight I did because my daughter had asked me to come. Emily called me the week before, her voice carrying that particular flatness she had developed over the past few years. The one that said everything was fine, in a tone that meant nothing was. Dad Daniel's family is hosting an anniversary dinner for the company. I want you there. You sure you want me at a Carter event? I asked. I'm sure I want you there, she said. Not the same thing. I understood the difference. I found her standing near the long dining table when I arrived, checking place settings with the focused expression of someone who had learned that if she did not check everything herself, something would go wrong and she would be blamed for it. She wore a navy dress, her dark hair pulled back, and she looked beautiful the way people look beautiful when they are exhausted down to the bone, but refuse to let it show. You look tired, Em, I said, pulling her into a hug. She pressed her face against my shoulder for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to mean something, short enough that no one in the room would notice. I'm fine, Dad, she said, stepping back, smoothing the front of her dress. I'm really glad you came. I spotted Tommy at a smaller table near the far corner, sitting between 2 other children. His age pushing a bread roll around his plate, with the bored determination of an 8-year-old who had been told to behave. I had positioned myself earlier near the main table with a clear line of sight to him, close enough to reach him fast if the evening went sideways in the way my gut had been telling me all week it might. The room itself was the kind of room designed to make you feel the weight of other people's money. Crystal chandeliers, white linen pressed sharp enough to cut, servers moving between 50 guests without making a sound. I noticed the security camera mounted in the upper corner near the doorway to the kitchen, a dark half-dome angled to cover the full length of the dining area. I filed that away without knowing yet why it mattered. Richard Carter held court at the head of the table, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had been told he was important. So many times he had stopped questioning it. His wife Margaret sat 2 seats down, wearing a cream jacket, and an expression that suggested the food, the room, and most of the people in it were slightly beneath her usual standards. Daniel sat to his father's right, laughing at something Richard said, his hand wrapped around a glass of red wine, looking for all the world like a man without a single thing pressing on his conscience. He had not looked at Emily once since I arrived. Dinner was served at 8. The servers brought out plates of roasted beef tenderloin, and Emily stood to help distribute the portions to the far end of the table, moving quickly, efficiently, the way she always moved when she was trying to be invisible and useful at the same time. She had spent close to a month preparing this evening the floral arrangements, the menu, the seating chart, and Daniel had told his family's business contacts that the company's event coordinator had handled everything. I watched Emily set the last plate down, then finally reach for one herself, lowering into her chair with the careful movements of someone whose feet had been hurting for hours. Richard looked up from his plate. "What do you think you're doing?" he said. His voice cut across 3 separate conversations. The table pulled quiet the way rooms do when something dangerous enters them. Emily looked up. "I'm sorry. The Hendersons at the far end haven't been served yet." Emily glanced down the table. Every plate had food on it. Every single one. Her jaw tightened just slightly. I saw it because I had been watching her face for 34 years. "I believe everyone has been served, Richard," she said, keeping her voice level. Richard set his knife down against the rim of his plate with a sharp, deliberate click. "You believe," he repeated as though the word itself offended him. Then he picked up the piece of tenderloin from his own plate. With his bare hand, drew his arm back and threw it across the table directly into Emily's face. The sound it made was small. That was the thing that stayed with me, how small the sound was for something so enormous. A soft, wet impact. Red wine sauce across her cheek, her chin, her hair, the front of the navy dress she had bought for this evening. You forgot your place in this house," Richard said, and his voice was perfectly calm as though he had simply corrected a minor error in accounting. 50 people sat around that table. Not one of them made a sound. My eyes went to Daniel. I watched him look at his wife, at the sauce running down her cheek, at her hands gripping the edge of the table to keep them from shaking, and then I watched him pick up his knife and fork and cut into his food. That was the moment. Not Richard's arm pulling back. Not the impact. Not the words. The moment was Daniel Carter looking at his wife's face and then choosing his dinner. Emily's chin was trembling. She pressed her lips together hard and stared at the tablecloth, and I could see the enormous effort it cost her to keep her composure in front of 50 people who were all pretending to study their own plates. My chest felt like something had been set on fire inside it. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I walked to Emily first. She was sitting perfectly still, both hands flat on the tablecloth sauce drying on her cheek, and along her jawline, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere between her plate and the middle distance. Her chin had stopped trembling. That was almost worse, the way she had forced herself into stillness, the way she had learned somewhere over the past 8 years, to make herself small and quiet and unreadable in rooms full of people who had hurt her. I picked up the linen napkin from beside my own plate. I crouched down slightly so I was level with her face and began to wipe the sauce away, slowly, carefully, the way I had wiped away tears and scraped knees and chocolate ice cream from that same face when she was 4 years old, and the world had not yet taught her that she needed to be small. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking at the edges. "Don't make it worse." "I'm not going to make anything worse," I said quietly. "I promise." I set the napkin down on the table. Then I straightened up, turned around, and walked toward Richard Carter. The room was so quiet, I could hear my own footsteps on the hardwood floor. 50 people, not one of them breathing loud enough to matter. Richard watched me come with the expression of a man who had never once in his life been walked toward by someone who wasn't afraid of him. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the corner of his mouth pulling into something that thought it was a smile. "What exactly do you think you're going to do?" he said. "You going to hit me, old man, in front of all these people?" I stopped 2 feet from him. I looked at him, really looked at him the way you look at something you want to remember clearly. And then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out my phone. I dialed 911. I put it on speaker. The operator's voice filled the dining room like a stone dropped into still water. 911, what is your emergency?" Richard's smile collapsed so fast. It was almost worth everything that had led to this moment. I need to report an assault, I said, keeping my voice steady and clear. The location is a private residence on Bellagio Road in Bel Air, Los Angeles. A man named Richard Carter has just physically struck a woman in the face with food in front of more than 50 witnesses. There is security camera footage covering the entire dining area. I am the victim's father, and I am requesting police response immediately. Sir, I'm dispatching officers to your location now. Can you stay on the line? I said. Margaret Carter shoved her chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. Her face had gone the color of old paper, and her voice when it came out was shaking with a fury she was trying to dress up as authority. You have lost your mind, she snapped her finger, pointing at me across the table. This is a private family matter, and you have absolutely no right to involve the police in what happens inside this home. I turned to look at her. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth, but my voice came out as level as a carpenter's line. A private family matter, I said, does not include a man throwing food into a woman's face in front of 50 dinner guests. That is called battery under California law, Mrs. Carter, and it does not become legal because it happens inside an expensive house. Daniel was on his feet now. His face had gone pale and tight, the wine glass still in his hand, like he had forgotten he was holding it. He took 2 steps toward me, his voice low and urgent. Harold, please, put the phone down. My father lost his temper. It was a mistake. We can handle this without... You have had 8 years to handle things, I said. I kept my eyes on his face and I did not look away. 8 years of watching your wife be spoken to and treated in ways that no decent man allows. Tonight you sat in that chair and you cut your food while sauce ran down her face. So no, Daniel, we are not handling this your way. Not anymore. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand tightened around the wine glass until his knuckles went white, and for a moment I thought the glass might actually break. From somewhere down the long private road outside, a sound rose through the tall cypress trees and the manicured silence of Bel Air. Sirens. Growing louder. I walked back to Emily. She had risen from her chair on her own, standing now with her shoulders pulled back, and her chin lifted, her eyes bright with something that had been locked away for a very long time and was only now beginning to find its way out. She reached out and grabbed my arm with both hands, and I felt her fingers trembling against my sleeve. Tommy, she said. I've got him, I said. Tommy had already climbed down from his chair at the corner table, drawn by the noise and the electricity in the room, his small face confused and alert. I crossed to him in 4 strides, crouched down and put both hands on his shoulders. Hey, buddy, I said, keeping my voice easy the way you keep your voice easy when a child needs to believe that the adults have things under control. We're going to head out early tonight, you and me and Mom. Sound good? Tommy looked past me at the room full of frozen, staring adults, then back at my face. He was 8 years old and sharp as a tack, and he knew something had happened that he didn't have the words for yet. Okay, Grandpa, he said, and slipped his hand into mine. I stood up. I took Emily's hand in my other hand. We walked through the dining room, past 50 people who parted without a word. Past Richard Carter, sitting rigid at the head of his table, past Margaret, who was pressing a phone to her ear with shaking hands, past Daniel, who stood in the middle of the room holding an empty wine glass and watching us go with an expression I had no interest in reading. The front door of the Carter house closed behind us with a soft, final click. The first police cruiser was already turning through the iron gate at the bottom of the drive, its lights painting the cypress trees red and blue in the warm September dark. The drive from Bel Air to Pasadena takes 40 minutes on a good night. Tonight it took 53 because I missed a turn on the 110 and did not notice until we were already past the exit, because my hands were on the wheel and my eyes were on the road. But my mind was still standing in that dining room watching my daughter's face. Tommy fell asleep in the back seat somewhere around the interchange. One moment he was sitting up, asking in a small, careful voice whether Mom was okay, and the next his head had dropped sideways against the window and his breathing had gone slow. And even the way only children can manage after the world has frightened them badly enough to exhaust them. Emily sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her head turned toward the window. She had used the napkin I kept in the glove compartment to clean most of the sauce from her face, but there was still a faint reddish stain along her hairline that she hadn't been able to reach. And every time the highway lights swept through the car, I could see it and felt something tighten in my chest so hard it was difficult to breathe normally. "You don't have to talk," I told her. "I know," she said. Then after a long moment, "Thank you for coming tonight, Dad." "I will always come," I said. "You know that." She pressed her lips together and turned her face back toward the window, and I saw her shoulders shake once, just once, before she pulled them straight again. My house in Pasadena is nothing like the Carter estate. It is a single-story craftsman on a street of similar houses, with a front porch that needs repainting and a Meyer lemon tree in the backyard that Dorothy planted the spring before Tommy was born. The porch light was on because I always leave it on when I go out at night. Dorothy started that habit, and I never stopped it even after she was gone. I carried Tommy inside without waking him, settled him on the pull-out sofa in the guest room with his shoes off and a blanket pulled up to his chin. He stirred once, mumbled something I couldn't make out, and went back under. I stood in this doorway for a moment, watching him breathe, 8 years old. He had sat at that table tonight, with no idea what was happening around him, only that something was wrong, and that his grandfather had come to take him and his mother somewhere else. He had put his hand in mine without hesitation. I went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Emily was sitting at the table when I came in, still in the navy dress, the stain on her hairline catching the kitchen light. She had her hands wrapped around nothing, just holding the shape of a cup that wasn't there yet. And when she looked up at me, her eyes were so red and swollen that I realized she had been crying in the bathroom while I settled Tommy and had come back out determined to look like she hadn't been. "Sit down, Em," I said. "I'm making tea." "I'm okay." "I know you are," I said. "Sit down anyway." She sat. I made the tea the way Dorothy taught me, loose leaf, 2 minutes, not 3, with a small spoonful of honey, because Emily had never been able to drink it any other way since she was 7 years old. I set the mug in front of her and pulled out the chair across the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the kitchen held us in its familiar quiet, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock above the stove, the smell of lemon from the tree outside the window that always came through on warm nights. Then Emily made a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like something breaking loose from somewhere deep in her chest, and she put both hands over her face and began to cry. Not the careful, controlled tears she had been holding back in the car. These were the kind of tears that had been stored up for years, that came out of a person all at once, when they finally reached somewhere safe enough to let them. Her shoulders shook, and her breath came in ragged pulls, and she pressed her hands harder against her face like she could push it all back in. And I got up from my chair and went around the table and put my hands on her shoulders and just held on while she fell apart. "I'm sorry," she kept saying between the sobs. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." "Don't you apologize," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended, because my own throat had gone tight. "Don't you dare apologize for this. I should have left years ago. I should have seen it." "Emily." I crouched down beside her chair so I could see her face. She lowered her hands, her cheeks soaked her eyes, searching mine with an expression that broke something open in me that I had been keeping closed all evening. Listen to me. You loved someone. You tried to make something work. There is not one single thing in that worth apologizing for. She shook her head hard like she didn't believe me or couldn't yet. Did I waste 8 years, Had? Her voice cracked on the last word. 8 years of my life, did I just throw them away? I thought about Dorothy. I thought about the way she used to sit at this same table in the chair Emily was sitting in now. And look at me with that particular expression. She had the one that meant she already knew the answer to something and was waiting patiently for me to find it myself. I looked at the photograph on the shelf above the counter, the one from Tommy's first birthday, where Dorothy was laughing at something out of frame with her whole face the way she always laughed. No, I said. You didn't waste them. You gave them to someone who didn't know what to do with them. That is not the same thing. That is never the same thing. Emily stared at me for a long moment. Then she let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere below her ribcage, shaky and uneven, and leaned forward and put her forehead against my shoulder. I held my daughter in my kitchen in Pasadena while the lemon tree moved in the warm night air outside the window, and I thought about all the things I should have said sooner, and all the moments I had told myself she was strong enough to handle it on her own. She was strong enough. She had always been strong enough. That was never the point. What do we do now? She asked, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I straightened up. I looked at the photograph of Dorothy one more time. Then I looked at my daughter. First you sleep, I said. Tomorrow we start finding out exactly what they did. To understand what happened at that dinner table, you have to understand what Emily walked into 8 years ago and what I chose not to see. I have spent a great deal of time since that September night sitting with that particular truth. Not the comfortable version of it where I tell myself I respected my daughter's independence and trusted her judgment. The real version where I admitted to myself that I saw the warning signs early and decided they were not my business to address. That is a harder thing to sit with. I have been sitting with it anyway. Emily met Daniel Carter in the spring of 2014 at a fundraising event for a children's hospital that a mutual friend had dragged her to. She called me the next morning, and I knew from the first 3 words, "Dad, I met someone," that this was different from the other times she had said those words. There was a looseness in her voice, an ease that had not been there in years. She laughed twice during that phone call for no reason I could identify, and when I asked her what he was like, she said, "He's kind, Dad. He's genuinely kind." And the way she said it told me that kindness had not been in great supply in her life recently. They married in September of 2015 in a ceremony at a garden venue in Pasadena that Dorothy and I helped pay for. It was a beautiful afternoon, warm, the kind of golden September light that makes everything look like a memory while it is still happening. Dorothy cried during the vows, which I had fully expected, and she gripped my hand so tightly through the whole ceremony that my fingers were numb by the time the officiant said they could kiss. But I remember something else from that day, something I filed away and did not examine for a long time afterward. During the reception, I watched Richard Carter move through the room. He did not mingle the way guests mingle at a wedding, moving from group to group, offering congratulations, letting the occasion belong to the 2 people getting married. Richard worked the room the way a man works a business meeting, deliberate, assessing. He spent 40 minutes with Daniel's firm's senior partners and approximately 4 minutes with Emily's college friends. When he finally made his way to Dorothy and me, he shook my hand with exactly the right amount of pressure and said all exactly the right things, and when he walked away, Dorothy leaned close to my ear and said very quietly, "That man is performing." I told her she was being uncharitable. She gave me the look she always gave me when I said something she was going to be proven right about, and went back to her champagne. Dorothy was the one who noticed things first. She always was. She had a quality I have never been able to fully describe, a kind of emotional clarity that cut through surface behavior and landed directly on what was true underneath it. She saw people plainly without the filters most of us use to make the world more comfortable. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and occasionally one of the things that made her very difficult to argue with. In the first year of Emily and Daniel's marriage, Dorothy mentioned 3 separate times that Emily seemed different when Daniel's family was present. Quieter, more careful with her words. Dorothy said it the way she said most important things, not as an accusation or an alarm, but as a simple observation placed gently on the table between us, waiting to see what I would do with it. What I did with it was not enough. The first real moment I should have acted came at Thanksgiving of 2016, 14 months into the marriage. Daniel and Emily hosted at their apartment in Silver Lake. Dorothy and I drove down from Pasadena. Richard and Margaret arrived 40 minutes late without apology and immediately rearranged the seating so that Richard sat at the head of the table in the apartment that Emily and Daniel paid for, at the table Emily had set after a meal Emily had spent 2 days preparing. Margaret spent the first 20 minutes after they arrived, finding small things to comment on. The centerpiece was a little busy. The wine was a California Pinot when perhaps something French would have been more appropriate for the occasion. Emily smiled and nodded at every comment, and I watched her hands move to her wine glass, and back to her lap, and back to her wine glass over and over, in the way hands move when their owner is working very hard to stay composed. Daniel said nothing. I told myself he was navigating a difficult situation. I told myself all marriages required accommodation of difficult family members. I told myself Emily was strong and capable and did not need her father to fight her battles. The second moment came in March of 2021. Dorothy had been sick for several months by then, a diagnosis that had come in the previous October, and that we were both still learning how to carry. Emily called me one evening, her voice thick, to say that she wanted to drive up to spend the weekend with us. She needed to see her mother. Dorothy was having a good stretch that week, and I told Emily, yes, of course, come up Saturday. Emily did not come Saturday. She called Friday evening to say that Daniel had explained they were needed at a Carter family event that weekend, and that it would cause problems if they missed it. She said she was sorry. She said she would come the following weekend instead. She did not say, I chose this. She did not say, Daniel insisted. She did not say anything except that she was sorry in that flattened voice that had become her default register for conversations about her marriage. Dorothy died on a Tuesday morning in November of 2021 while Emily was sitting in a conference room in Century City, presenting a design proposal to a client she had rescheduled twice already because Daniel had needed her available for Carter family obligations. I called Emily's cell phone and she picked up on the second ring, and I told her, and I heard the sound. She made a sharp, broken intake of breath, like something tearing. And then I heard in the background the distinct sound of a conference room, other voices, the rustle of presentation materials. She drove to Pasadena alone. Daniel came 4 hours later after a meeting that apparently could not be moved. He stood on the opposite side of the living room from Emily during the first hour of that evening, near his father, who had come with Margaret, and I watched my daughter stand beside her mother's favorite chair, with her arms wrapped around herself, and her jaw tight and her eyes red. And I thought about walking across that room and standing next to her. I did not do it. I told myself she had Daniel. I told myself she was holding together beautifully and did not need me to make a scene. I told myself a great many comfortable things that allowed me to stay where I was. That was my failure. Not the only one, but the clearest one. The moment I would take back above all others if I could. I sat at my kitchen table in Pasadena in the small hours of that September morning, the tea gone cold in front of me. And I let myself feel the full weight of it. Every moment I had looked away, every reassurance I had accepted too easily, every time I had told myself that Emily was strong enough to handle what was happening to her. She was. She had always been strong enough. But strength is not the same as being unsupported. And I had left her unsupported for far too long. I would not make that mistake again. The morning after the dinner, I made 2 phone calls before 8 o'clock. The first was to Tommy's school to let them know he would be absent, and that his emergency contact information needed to be updated temporarily to reflect his current address. The woman on the phone was professional and kind and asked no questions, and I was grateful for both. The second call changed everything. Charles Morgan picked up on the third ring, which told me he was already at his desk. Charles was always already at his desk. In 30 years of friendship, I had never once called him before 9 in the morning and found him anywhere other than his office on 6th Street in downtown Los Angeles, drinking black coffee from a thermos he refilled at home every morning, because he did not trust the coffee machines that other law firms considered adequate. "Harold," he said. Not a greeting exactly. More like a man setting down whatever he was doing and giving you his full attention. "I need your help," I said. "Not for me. For Emily." There was a brief pause, the kind Charles made when he was already thinking 3 steps ahead of the conversation. "Tell me everything," he said. I told him. All of it. The dinner, Richard, the food thrown across the table, the 50 witnesses, the 911 call, driving home with Emily and Tommy in the dark. Emily crying in my kitchen until 2 in the morning. Charles listened without interrupting once, which was one of the things that made him exceptional at his work, and occasionally maddening as a friend. When I finished, the line was quiet for 4 full seconds. "I need you both in my office this morning," he said. "Can Emily come? I'll ask her." "Harold." His voice shifted slightly, still measured but carrying something underneath it. "But before you bring her in, I want you to understand something. What you've described to me may not begin and end with last night. A man like Richard Carter does not behave that way without a long history of believing he can. And a marriage that produces that kind of behavior in a dining room in front of 50 people has almost certainly been producing smaller versions of it behind closed doors for years. I'm going to need Emily to be prepared to talk about things she may not want to talk about." "She'll talk," I said. "She's ready." Another pause. "Good. 9:30. Don't be late." Charles Morgan's office occupied the 14th floor of a building on 6th Street that had been renovated twice since he first leased space there in 1991 and still managed to look exactly the same, solid, unornamented, built for the kind of work that required concentration rather than impression. His assistant, a composed young woman named Grace, brought us water without being asked and closed the door behind her with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that the conversations in that room required privacy. Charles himself looked as he always looked, like a man who had decided several decades ago exactly who he was, and had not found any reason to revise the decision since. He was 62, lean with silver hair cut short, and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he never seemed to actually use for reading. He had represented my company through 3 contract disputes and 1 genuinely ugly partnership dissolution, and he had never once raised his voice or lost his composure, and I had never once doubted that he was the smartest person in whatever room he happened to be occupying. He shook Emily's hand and held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake, looking at her directly. "I'm sorry about last night," he said. "I'm sorry it happened, and I'm sorry it took something like that to get you here." Emily's chin wobbled for just a moment before she steadied it. "Thank you," she said. We sat. Charles opened a yellow legal pad. He was one of the last attorneys in Los Angeles, who still worked primarily on paper, a fact he considered a professional advantage rather than an affectation, and looked at Emily. "See, I've known your father for 30 years, he said. I need you to know that everything you say in this room stays in this room, and that my job right now is not to judge any decisions you've made or haven't made. My job is to understand what has actually happened so I can tell you what your options are. Can you do that?" Emily nodded. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, very still, with the deliberate stillness of someone who had learned to use composure as armor. "Start from the beginning," Charles said. "Not last night. The beginning." Emily talked for nearly an hour. She started with the first Thanksgiving, moved through the years in careful, precise order. The comments, the exclusions, the small humiliations delivered in front of audiences large enough to make any response seem like an overreaction. Charles wrote steadily and asked occasional questions, short and specific, that redirected her when she began to summarize rather than describe. He wanted details, dates when she had them, exact words when she could remember them. Then he shifted. "Tell me about your finances," he said. "Joint accounts, personal accounts, your business." Emily straightened slightly. "I keep my business accounts separate from our personal accounts. I always have. I didn't want the design firm's finances mixed up with household money." "Did Daniel have any access to your business accounts?" Emily hesitated just briefly, a small hitch in her composure that Charles caught the same moment I did. "I gave him limited authorization," she said. "When I traveled for work, site visits, client installations, sometimes I'd be out of state for a week or more. I gave him authorization to handle paperwork, sign off on routine invoices, manage the household bills, just to keep things running smoothly while I was away." Charles wrote something on his legal pad. "And how often were you traveling in the past 3 years?" 8 to 10 trips a year, some of them 2 weeks long." Charles set his pen down very deliberately, the way a man sets something down when he wants the person across from him to understand that what comes next is important. "Emily, I need you to pull every bank statement from every account, personal and business, going back 4 years. Every contract, every authorization document, every wire transfer record. Everything with your signature on it and everything that should have your signature on it but might not." Emily's eyes moved to me, then back to Charles. Her voice came out steady, but I could see her throat working hard to keep it that way. "How bad do you think it is?" Charles looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk and picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "Grace, I need you to pull the financial disclosure template for California family court proceedings and send it to my printer." He set the phone down and looked back at Emily. "I don't know yet how bad it is, but I know that a family that behaves the way this one behaved last night in front of 50 witnesses is not a family that has been behaving well in private. And I intend to find out exactly what that means for you." He pushed his chair back and stood, which in 30 years I had come to understand meant the meeting was entering its working phase rather than its talking phase. "We start today," he said. 3 days after the dinner, the Carters made their move. I had been expecting it. A family like the Carters did not absorb a public humiliation, and make no mistake, that is exactly what the 911 call had been, regardless of who deserved it, without responding. Richard Carter had spent decades building a version of himself that required other people's deference to function. The moment that version was challenged in front of 50 witnesses, the machinery of his world would begin working to restore it. What I had not expected was to be grateful for it. Charles called me at 7:45 in the morning, which told me the delivery had arrived early. "They filed yesterday afternoon," he said without preamble. "Defamation, intentional interference with business relations, and negligent infliction of emotional distress." They're also demanding a public written apology from you to Richard within 72 hours. I was standing in my kitchen in Pasadena, still in the clothes I had slept in, a cup of coffee going cold on the counter. Tommy was eating cereal at the table behind me, carefully picking out the pieces he didn't like and arranging them in a separate pile at the edge of his bowl with the focused precision of a child who needed something small and controllable to concentrate on. "A public apology," I said. "Signed and notarized," Charles said. "Published in the Los Angeles Business Journal if possible." I looked at Tommy's cereal pile. I thought about Richard Carter sitting at the head of a table that did not belong to him, throwing food at my daughter's face, and then instructing his attorneys to demand a public apology from the man who had called the police. "Charles," I said, "what do you want to do?" I heard something on the other end of the line that I had not heard from Charles Morgan in 30 years of knowing him. He laughed. Not loudly. Charles did not do anything loudly, but it was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes out of a person when something strikes them as both outrageous and perfectly timed. "I want to give them exactly what they asked for," he said. "A lawsuit." An hour later, Emily and I were back in Charles's office on 6th Street. He had the complaint printed and spread across the desk when we arrived, annotated in his small, precise handwriting with notes in the margins that I could not read upside down, but that covered nearly every page. Emily picked up the first page and read it with the expression of someone identifying an animal they have encountered before, but hoped never to see again. "They're calling you a public menace," she said, setting it back down. Her voice had a sharp edge that I recognized, not anger exactly, but the particular tone she got when something had pushed her past the point of being careful with her words. "They're saying you deliberately orchestrated a scene to damage the Carter family's professional reputation." "They are," Charles said. He settled into his chair and folded his hands on the desk with the composure of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "And by filing that complaint, they have triggered mandatory financial discovery under California civil procedure, which means that in order to establish damages to their business reputation, they are now required to open their financial records to us. All of them. 5 years of Carter Interactive's accounts, internal transfers, partnership agreements, and subsidiary documentation." Emily stared at him. "They did that to themselves." "Enthusiastically," Charles said. Emily pressed both hands flat on the desk and leaned forward, and for the first time since the dinner, I saw something kindle in her eyes that was not grief or exhaustion or barely contained fury. It was sharp and clear, and it looked more than anything else like recognition. "They thought they were scaring us," she said. "They did," Charles said. "People who have operated without consequence for a long time frequently mistake aggression for strength. Richard Carter has never had anyone push back. He genuinely does not know what that looks like yet." Charles was already reaching for his pen. "I'm filing our response this afternoon," he said. "Counterclaim for emotional distress, medical expenses, and property damage. The dress Emily was wearing has evidentiary value, by the way, so do not wash it. We will also be requesting the full 5-year financial disclosure as part of discovery. Standard timeline from the court will give us access to those records within 2 to 3 weeks." Emily sat back in her chair. Some of the color had come back into her face, not the artificial brightness of someone performing composure, but the real kind, the kind that comes from feeling the ground solidify under your feet after a long time of standing on something uncertain. "What happens when they see the counterclaim?" she asked. Charles looked up from his legal pad. "They panic," he said simply. "And panicked people make mistakes." He paused, tapping his pen once against the pad. "The financial statements should start coming through within the week. I want you both available when they do. His phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, then back at us. "I'll be in touch," he said, and reached for it. Emily and I walked out into the corridor together. She pushed the elevator button and stood with her arms crossed, not tightly, just holding herself together in the loose, careful way of someone who has learned to do it without making it obvious. He said they'd panic. She said more to herself than to me. "Charles is usually right about these things," I said. The elevator opened. Emily stepped in, then turned to look at me, and something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the shape one makes just before it arrives. "Good," she said. The doors closed. "Before I show you what Charles found in those financial records, and I promise you nobody in that room was ready for it, drop a comment with the number 7 so I know you're still with me. Every single comment means the world." A quick note, this story contains some fictional elements woven in for depth and storytelling. If that's not something you'd like to continue with, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. The financial statements arrived on a Thursday morning 1 week after Charles filed the counterclaim. I was at Charles's office when they came through. He had asked me to be there, which told me he was expecting something significant enough that he did not want to deliver it over the phone. Emily was already seated when I arrived, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup from the place downstairs, her posture straight in the way it got when she was bracing for something. Charles opened the files on his laptop without ceremony and turned the screen so we could both see it. The first transfer was dated 18 months earlier. $75,000 moved from the joint checking account that Emily and Daniel shared into a Carter Interactive subsidiary account registered in Century City. The transfer description read, "Consulting services rendered," and it was signed off with a digital authorization code registered to Daniel Carter. Emily leaned forward. Her coffee cup came down on the edge of the desk harder than she intended, and some of it sloshed over the rim onto her fingers. She did not seem to notice. "What consulting services?" she asked. "There are no corresponding invoices," Charles said. "No contract, no deliverable of any kind on record." He scrolled down. There were more, not large amounts individually, that was clearly intentional. 3,000 here, 8,000 there. 12,000 from Emily's personal savings account in February of the previous year. 22,000 drawn against the business line of credit attached to her design firm, processed through the limited authorization she had granted Daniel for routine paperwork during her travel periods. By the time Charles reached the bottom of the third page, the number sitting at the bottom of the screen was $310,000. Emily's face had gone the color of old concrete. She was gripping the arms of her chair with both hands, her knuckles straining white against the leather, and her breathing had gone shallow and fast in the way breathing does when a body is trying to process something the mind has not caught up to yet. $310,000, she said. The words came out flat and precise, like she was reading coordinates off a map. "Over approximately 36 months, Charles said. Divided across 4 separate accounts, none of the individual transfers large enough to trigger automatic bank fraud alerts. Whoever structured this knew exactly what thresholds to stay under." Emily pushed her chair back from the desk and stood up abruptly, turning away from the screen. She pressed both hands against her mouth, her shoulders rising toward her ears, and I heard a sound come out of her that was not quite a sob, but was the compressed version of one, the kind that comes out when a person is fighting with everything they have to keep from falling apart in a room where they feel they cannot afford to. "Emily," I said, starting to rise. She held one hand out toward me. "Stop, not yet," and took 3 long breaths with her back to us. Then she turned around. Her eyes were wet and her jaw was set, and her hands, when she lowered them, were shaking visibly at her sides. "There are signatures on those authorizations," she said to Charles. My signatures. Yes, Charles said. 6 documents in total. I didn't sign them. Charles held her gaze. I know. That's why I've already contacted a forensic document examiner. He'll be here at 2 o'clock this afternoon. The examiner arrived precisely on time. A quiet, methodical man who set up his equipment on the conference table without small talk and worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this particular thing many hundreds of times. He compared the signatures on the 6 authorization documents against 3 verified samples of Emily's genuine signature pulled from her mortgage application, her business registration filing, and her passport renewal form. He worked for 40 minutes. When he was finished, he removed his glasses, set them on the table, and looked at Charles. 4 of the 6 are inconsistent with the verified samples, he said. Pen lift points are wrong. Pressure distribution doesn't match. The letter formation on the capital E is particularly telling your client forms it with a single continuous motion. These were done in 2 strokes. He paused. These are forgeries. Competent ones, but forgeries. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Emily had been standing by the window during the examination, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her eyes fixed on the examiner's hands moving over the documents. When he said the word forgeries, she closed her eyes and pressed her lips together so hard the color left them entirely. I stood up and went to her. I put my hand on her shoulder and felt her trembling underneath my palm, not the dramatic shaking of someone falling apart, but the deep cellular tremor of someone absorbing a blow that has reached below the surface. He forged my name, she said. Her voice was very quiet. He sat across from me at dinner for 3 years and forged my name. Emily. I started. Don't. She opened her eyes and looked at me, and what was in them was not grief anymore. It was something colder and cleaner and far more focused. I'm not going to cry about this, Dad. I'm done crying about things he did. She turned back to Charles. What do we do next? She asked. Charles picked up his pen. We keep pulling, he said. While Charles was building our case, Daniel was busy dismantling what little remained of himself. The first message arrived on a Saturday morning, 4 days after the financial statements came through. Emily showed it to me over breakfast at my kitchen table in Pasadena, sliding her phone across the wood without a word. Tommy was in the backyard with a soccer ball, his voice drifting in through the screen door in bursts of self-narrated commentary, the way 8-year-olds narrate everything when they think no one is listening. The message read, Emily, I know I failed you at that dinner. I know I should have stood up. I'm so sorry. Please call me, please. Emily watched my face as I read it. Her own face was carefully neutral, not the careful neutral of someone hiding pain, but the careful neutral of someone who has already processed a feeling and moved past it and does not intend to go back. Are you going to respond? I asked. To, she said, and reached across the table and took her phone back and set it face down beside her coffee cup. 3 days later, the second message arrived. This one was longer. I read it over Emily's shoulder when she showed me standing in the hallway outside Tommy's room after we had put him to bed. Daniel had written that Emily had escalated a private family matter into a public spectacle. That calling the police had been an act of aggression, not protection. That she had humiliated his father in front of business associates whose relationships were critical to the company, and that she needed to understand the damage she had caused before she did anything else that could not be undone. Emily read it twice. Then she set her phone on the hallway table and pressed the heels of both hands against her eyes so hard I could see the pressure whitening the skin around them. He's blaming me, she said, her voice fracturing at the edges despite herself. His father threw food at my face in front of 50 people and he's blaming me. I know, I said. I spent 8 years making myself smaller so that family would be more comfortable. Her voice was rising now, not in volume but in intensity, climbing towards something that had been compressed for a very long time. 8 years of apologizing for things I didn't do wrong, of laughing at things that weren't funny, of pretending I didn't hear what I heard. And he is sitting there right now telling me that I caused damage. She picked up her phone again and looked at the message for a long moment. Then she put it in her pocket and straightened her spine and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. And I followed her because I did not know what else to do. I thought about Daniel, as I had known him in the first year of the marriage. The man who had called me on a Tuesday afternoon to ask nervously and seriously for advice on what Emily's favorite flowers were, because he wanted to surprise her for no reason at all. I thought about the single time he had defended her in front of Richard in the first year at a dinner where Richard had dismissed one of Emily's design projects as a hobby. Daniel had said quietly but clearly that Emily's firm had grossed 4 times what he himself had earned that year, and that calling it a hobby was factually inaccurate. Richard had looked at his son for a long moment. Then he had changed the subject. And Daniel had never done it again. I had thought about that evening many times since the dinner at Bel Air, about what it must have cost Daniel to say that, and what it must have cost him more to never say anything like it again. Richard Carter did not raise a son. He manufactured one assembled to specification, tested for compliance, corrected when necessary. The man Emily had married had been real, I believed that still. But he had been trained out of himself so gradually and so thoroughly that by the time the cost became visible, there was not enough of him left to pay it. That did not excuse what he had done. It explained it. Those were not the same thing, and I was careful not to confuse them. The third message came on a Wednesday night, 11 days after the financial statements. Emily was helping Tommy with a school project at the kitchen table, a diorama of a California mission that required an unreasonable quantity of popsicle sticks and had been due the following morning when her phone buzzed against the table surface. She glanced at the screen and her hands went still over the popsicle sticks. She turned the phone so I could see it from where I was sitting across the table. "If you continue with this divorce, Emily, you will lose everything. I am trying to warn you because I still care about you. But my father's attorneys are the best in the state, and they will make sure you walk away with nothing. Stop this now while you still can." Tommy looked up from the mission glue stick in hand. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily set the phone face down on the table. She looked at her son, at his 8-year-old face turned up toward hers, with that uncomplicated absolute trust that children carry before the world teaches them it is not always warranted, and she smiled at him. Not the exhausted performance of a smile I had been watching her produce for years. Something smaller and truer and more determined. "I'm great, baby," she said. "Hand me the popsicle sticks. Let's finish the roof." Tommy handed them over satisfied and went back to his narration. I looked at Emily across the table. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright with something that was not fear, had not been fear, since the examiner said the word forgeries, and she had decided to stop crying about things Daniel had done. She mouthed 2 words at me across Tommy's bent head and the half-finished California mission. "He's scared." I nodded once. Because she was right. A man who is confident in his position does not send threatening messages to his wife at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. A man who sends those messages is a man who knows that something has been found and is desperately trying to close a door that is already open. The following afternoon, the doorbell rang. I looked through the front window before I answered it. Daniel was standing on my porch in Pasadena, unshaven, his shirt untucked, his eyes carrying the particular hollowness of a man who had not slept properly in days. He was holding his car keys in one hand and turning them over and over between his fingers, the way people handle objects when their hands need something to do that their minds cannot provide. I stood at the front window for a moment, looking at Daniel through the glass. He had lost weight since the dinner, not dramatically, but enough that his shirt hung differently across his shoulders, the collar sitting loose in a way it hadn't before. His jaw was covered in 4 or 5 days of uneven stubble, and the skin under his eyes had the bruised, sunken look of someone who had been lying awake in the dark for too long, running the same calculations over and over and arriving at the same answer each time. He turned his car keys over between his fingers, over and over. A man with nowhere to put his hands. I went to the front door and opened it. I did not open the screen door. Daniel looked up. Something moved across his face when he saw me, relief maybe, or the ghost of it, the way a drowning man looks when he spots something to grab onto, even if what he is grabbing onto is the person watching him go under. "Harold," he said, "I need to talk to Emily." "She doesn't want to see you, Daniel." His jaw tightened. "I know she's angry. I know I deserve that. But there are things I need to explain to her. Things she doesn't have the full picture on. And if she would just give me 20 minutes, I think I could succeed." "Daniel." I kept my voice level the way you keep your voice level with someone who is close to the edge of something. "Emily does not owe you 20 minutes. Emily does not owe you anything at all right now." He pressed his lips together. His eyes went past me into the house, searching the hallway behind me the way eyes do when they are looking for something specific and trying not to appear to be looking. "You don't understand how complicated this is," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he pressed on before I could respond. The words coming faster, now tumbling over each other with the energy of someone who had been rehearsing them for days. "My father, the way he runs things, the way he's always run things, I didn't have a choice in most of it, Harold. You have to understand that. I grew up in that house. You learn what the rules are, and you follow them because the alternative is—" He stopped, swallowed. "You don't know what the alternative looks like." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the man who had called me nervously on a Tuesday afternoon to ask about Emily's favorite flowers. I thought about the single evening he had stood up at a dinner table and told his father quietly and clearly that Emily's work was not a hobby. I thought about how that had been the last time. "I understand more than you think," I said. Something shifted in his expression. The rehearsed desperation fell away for just a second, and underneath it was something rawer and more honest. Not grief exactly, but the particular look of a man who has just realized that the person in front of him already knows the answer to the question he has been building up to ask. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "What did you find?" The keys went still in his hand. I held his gaze and did not look away. "You should get yourself a very good lawyer, Daniel," I said. "The best one you can afford. And you should call them today, not tomorrow." The color left his face so completely and so quickly that for a moment I was genuinely concerned he might need to sit down. His mouth opened slightly, closed. He took one step backward on the porch, then another, moving the way people move when their legs are operating independently of their decision-making. He turned and walked to his car without another word, and I watched him go. This man my daughter had loved for 8 years. This man who had sat across from her at 1,000 dinners and held her hand in 100 waiting rooms and stood at the edge of a canyon with her once in Utah on a trip they had taken in the 2nd year of their marriage, and called me afterward laughing to say that Emily had tried to pretend she wasn't afraid of the height and had gripped his arm hard enough to leave marks. I watched him fold himself into the driver's seat of a car that probably cost more than my house, and I felt something that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the difficult territory between the two. I went back inside. Claire Collins was sitting on the sofa next to Emily when I came into the living room, a compact, bright-eyed woman in her early 30s with paint-stained fingers and the kind of easy, grounded presence that some people carry naturally and others spend a lifetime trying to manufacture. She had been Emily's first hire when the design firm was still operating out of a single rented room in Culver City, and she had stayed through every expansion and every difficult client and every period when the work was thin and the uncertainty was thick. Emily had called her the morning after Daniel's second message, and Claire had driven over from her apartment in Silver Lake that same evening with a bag of groceries and no questions, which was exactly the right thing to do. Tommy was curled against Emily's other side, his head on her shoulder, holding a picture book he was not reading. He had stopped asking direct questions about what was happening several days ago, which told me he had absorbed enough of the atmosphere of the house to understand that some things were not ready to be talked about yet. Children that age are more perceptive than adults usually credit them for. Claire looked up at me when I came in, her eyebrows raised in the wordless question. I shook my head slightly. Gone. Claire reached over and put her hand over Emily's and squeezed once firmly, the way you hold on to someone when you want them to know that your grip is not going anywhere. Whatever you decide about the firm, Claire said, I'm not going anywhere either. I want you to know that. We built it together, and whatever shape it needs to take coming out of this, we rebuild it together. Emily's throat worked hard. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, blinking rapidly against the tears that were gathering whether she wanted them to or not. Then she pulled Tommy closer against her side and kissed the top of his head. Okay, she said, her voice rough at the edges. Okay. Tommy looked up from his book. Mom, your voice sounds funny, he said with the direct factual concern of an 8-year-old who does not yet know that sometimes the kindest thing to do is pretend not to notice. Emily let out a breath that was half sob and half laugh and pulled him tighter. I know, baby, she said. I know. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I stepped into the hallway and looked at the screen. A text from Charles. 6 words. Call me. Someone just came forward. She knocked on my door at 2:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had been lying awake looking at the ceiling for the past hour and a half, and when the knock came, I looked at the clock on the nightstand before I got up, the way you look at clocks at 2 in the morning when you want to fix the moment precisely in your memory, because something in you already knows it matters. Emily was standing in the hallway, in the gray sweatshirt she had borrowed from my closet 3 days after she arrived, the one Dorothy had bought me for a birthday years ago that I had never been able to throw away. Her face was pale and tight, and her eyes had the wide-cornered look of someone who has been sitting alone with a thought for too long and has finally reached the point where sitting alone with it is no longer possible. Dad, she said, I need to talk to you. Come in, I said. I was already moving toward the small lamp on the dresser. Sit down. She sat on the edge of the armchair in the corner of my room, the chair Dorothy used to read in, pulling her feet up underneath her, with a cup of tea and a book, and the specific, contented silence of a woman who had found exactly where she wanted to be. Emily sat on the very edge of it, both feet on the floor, her hands gripped together in her lap so tightly that the knuckles had gone white. Charles called me after you went to bed, she said. He wanted to tell me before tomorrow's meeting. I sat on the edge of the bed, facing her. Tell you what, my name. Her voice came out thin and strained like something being pulled past its tensile limit. It's on 2 companies, Dad. 2 companies I have never heard of that I did not know existed, that are apparently registered in my name as a co-founder. Charles says they're connected to something a former Carter employee brought to him, someone with documentation he's still going through. She pressed her lips together hard. If the FBI investigates those companies, and they look at the registration documents, and they see my name, he said they would have to look at me as a potential. She stopped, started again. He said as long as we can prove the signatures were forged, I'm a victim, not a suspect. He said the forgery evidence we already have is strong. But Dad, her voice broke on the word splitting open at the center of it. What if strong isn't enough? What if they look at all of it and they decide it's easier to believe I knew? What if I lose Tommy? The last 3 words came out in a register I had never heard from her before, raw and terrified in a way that had nothing to do with anger or exhaustion or the cold fury she had been carrying since the examiner said the word forgeries. This was the fear underneath all of it, the one she had been holding back since this began. My chest felt like it was being compressed from both sides simultaneously. I did not say what I wanted to say, which was that it would all be fine, that Charles would fix it, that the evidence was strong enough, and the truth was clear enough, and justice worked the way it was supposed to work. I did not say those things because Emily was 34 years old, and she deserved better than comfortable reassurances that I could not guarantee. Instead, I stood up and walked to the closet and reached up to the shelf above the hanging clothes, to the back left corner, where I kept the things I could not look at every day, but could not bring myself to put somewhere I couldn't reach. I brought out the wooden box. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, made from cedar with a simple brass clasp, that Dorothy had chosen herself at a craft store in Old Pasadena on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks before she died. She had been tired that day, moving more slowly than usual, but she had wanted to go herself and choose it herself. And she had stood in the aisle for a long time, running her fingers over different options, before she picked this one up and said simply, "This one." I had not opened it since the day she put the letter inside and handed it to me. I sat back down on the edge of the bed and held the box in both hands. Emily watched me, her knuckles still white, her breathing shallow and fast. "Your mother gave me this 3 weeks before she passed," I said. "She told me I would know when the right moment was to open it." Emily's eyes dropped to the box, her throat moved. I opened the clasp. The letter was folded in thirds, written on the cream notepaper Dorothy kept in the drawer of her writing desk. The paper with the small blue border that she had ordered from a stationery company in Vermont every Christmas for 15 years, because she said it was the only paper that felt right under her pen. The ink was blue. Her handwriting was the handwriting she always had, deliberate and slightly tilted to the right, with the capital letters just a little larger than strictly necessary, the way she wrote when she was trying to make sure the words would be read carefully. I unfolded it. My hands were not entirely steady. I read it aloud because Dorothy had written it to be read aloud, the way she had always understood instinctively that some things land differently in the air of a room than they do on a page. Harold. By the time you open this, I won't be there to say it myself, so I'm trusting you to say it for me when the moment comes. And I think you'll know the moment. If our girl ever falls, and she will, because everyone does, and she is braver than she knows, which means she will fall from higher than most, don't let her fall alone. Get down there with her, however far down it is, and then get back up together. She is going to be fine. I know this the way I know everything I am most certain of, not because I can prove it, but because I know her, and I know you. Take care of each other. All my love, always, Dorothy. The room was very quiet when I finished. Emily had both hands pressed over her mouth, and tears were running down her face in the fast, unguarded way that tears run when a person has stopped trying to manage them. Her shoulders shook in uneven pulses, and a sound came out from behind her hands that was grief and relief and something that did not have a name all at once pressing out of her chest, like something that had been sealed in there for 2 years and had finally found a way through. I got up from the bed and crossed to the armchair and crouched down in front of her, and she took her hands away from her mouth and wrapped her arms around my neck and held on, and I held on to her, and for a long time neither of us needed to say anything at all because Dorothy had already said it. When Emily finally pulled back, her face was soaked and her eyes were swollen, and she looked more like herself than she had since the night of the dinner. She knew, Emily said, her voice wrecked and wondering. She wrote that, and she knew. She always knew things early, I said. My own voice had gone rough in a way I was not going to apologize for. It was one of her most inconvenient qualities. Emily made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. She looked at me with her red eyes and her wet cheeks and her borrowed sweatshirt, and something settled in her expression. Not the hardness of the past 2 weeks, not the careful composure, but something quieter and more solid underneath all of it. "Okay," she said. "We don't stop." "We don't stop," I said. She reached out and touched the edge of the wooden box very gently with 2 fingers. "Can I keep the letter for a while?" she asked. "It was written for you," I said. "It was always yours." 2 days after Emily decided not to give up a woman I had never heard of, walked into Charles Morgan's office and changed everything. Her name was Rachel Moore. She was 38 years old, with the kind of composed, watchful face that belongs to people who have spent years in rooms where they were not supposed to notice things and noticed all of them anyway. She had been the senior accounts manager at Carter Interactive for 6 years before submitting her resignation on a Tuesday morning in June, 4 months before the dinner at Bel Air, without explanation and without a forwarding address for her personal effects. Charles had called me the morning after Emily's knock on my door, calm, precise, the way Charles delivered all news, regardless of its weight. "Someone wants to talk," he said. "She reached out through a colleague of mine in the LA Bar Association. Says she has documentation. I want you here when she comes in." I arrived at the 6th Street office at 9 o'clock to find Rachel already seated in the conference room, a canvas tote bag on the floor beside her chair, and a cup of coffee she had not touched, going cold on the table in front of her. She stood when I came in and shook my hand with a firm, dry grip and looked at me with the direct, slightly braced expression of someone who has made a decision they know is correct and is still frightened by it. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I want you to know that I'm not here because I'm a good person. I'm here because I stopped being able to sleep." I sat down across from her. "That's honest," I said. "I've been trying to be," she said. "It's newer than I'd like." Charles settled at the head of the table with his legal pad and looked at Rachel with the patient, unhurried attention he gave to everyone who sat across from him with something important to say. "Tell us what you know," he said. Rachel wrapped both hands around her cold coffee cup and began. She had taken the position at Carter Interactive in her early 30s, recruited from a mid-sized accounting firm in Burbank, with a salary offer that was, as she put it, difficult to decline responsibly. The work was straightforward for the first 2 years. Standard accounts management for a mid-sized gaming company, quarterly reporting, vendor payments, payroll processing. Nothing that raised any flags she could specifically identify, though she said now that there had been a quality to certain internal communications that she had not known how to name at the time. Things were compartmentalized in a way that seemed excessive, she said. Certain accounts, I was told, were handled by a separate division. Certain transfers I processed were described as intercompany loans between subsidiaries, which is normal enough in a larger organization. I processed them and moved on. When did that change? Charles asked. Rachel's jaw tightened. 18 months in. I was asked to reconcile a set of accounts that I hadn't worked with before. The revenue figures didn't match anything in the public-facing reports. When I asked my direct supervisor for clarification, he told me the discrepancy was related to offshore timing differences in payment processing, and that I should adjust the internal figures to align with the external report. She said it plainly without drama, in the flat tone of someone reciting a sequence of events they have memorized precisely because precision is the only thing that makes them bearable. I adjusted the figures, she said, twice. The third time I was asked to do it, I started keeping copies. Charles looked up from his legal pad. Copies of what specifically? Rachel reached into the canvas tote bag and lifted out a portable hard drive, small black, about the size of a paperback book, and set it on the conference table between us. Internal reconciliation reports showing the variance between actual revenue and reported revenue going back 4 years, she said. Transfer records for 47 subsidiary accounts, incorporation documents for 11 shell companies, and the internal memo from Richard Carter, dated 14 months ago, authorizing the expansion of what the memo refers to as the alternative revenue stream into 3 new states. Charles looked at the hard drive for a moment. Then he looked at me. The air in the conference room felt different than it had 60 seconds earlier. Heavier and cleaner at the same time, the way air feels just after a storm breaks. "Why are you coming forward now?" I asked her. "Specifically now, 4 months after you left." Rachel looked at her hands around the coffee cup. Her knuckles were not white, but the grip was tight enough that I could see the effort of it. "I read about the dinner," she said. "The incident at the Carter House in Bel Air. It was in the local news, just a brief item, but I recognized the address immediately. I had processed expense reports for events at that property for 3 years. I knew exactly whose house it was and whose dinner it was." She paused. "After I saw the article, I reached out to a former colleague who works with a firm in the LA Bar Association. She knew Charles Morgan. That's how I found my way here." She looked up at me directly. "I had information that could help, and I had been sitting on it for 4 months because I was scared of what Richard Carter could do to someone who talked. And then I read about what you did at that dinner, Mr. Bennett." Her voice tightened slightly around the edges. "A 66-year-old man with no lawyers and no plans standing up in that room and calling the police. And I thought—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "I thought that if you could stand up in that room, I could walk into this office." The conference room was quiet for a moment. Outside, 14 floors down 6th Street moved with its ordinary mid-morning traffic, entirely unaware. Charles picked up his pen. "Walk me through the subsidiary accounts," he said, "starting with the oldest." Rachel reached for the hard drive and plugged it into the laptop. Charles slid toward her, and her hands, I noticed, had finally stopped shaking. Before I reveal what Charles found buried deepest in those files, the thing that made Emily walk out of that conference room and press her back against the wall because her legs stopped working. "Leave a comment with 12 so I know you're still here." What comes next is the part I never saw coming. This story weaves in fictional elements for storytelling purposes. If you'd like to step away before we go further, this is your moment. No judgment, only gratitude for how far you've come. I thought the worst was already behind us. That was my mistake, believing that the thing you have already survived is the worst thing, that the ground stops moving once you have found your footing on it. Charles had warned me in his careful, measured way not to assume the picture was complete until he said it was complete. I had nodded and told him I understood. I had not fully understood. Charles called Emily and me back to the 6th Street office the following afternoon. He had been working through the contents of Rachel's hard drive since the previous evening, and when we arrived, he was already at the conference table with 3 monitors arranged in a shallow arc in front of him, an arrangement I had never seen in his office before, which told me the volume of material was significant enough to require it. Rachel was not there. She had given her testimony and her evidence and gone home to whatever version of her life existed after a decision like the one she had made. And I hoped, in the way you hope things, for people you have only met once, that she was sleeping better than she had been. Charles did not offer coffee. He waited until we were both seated, and then he turned one of the monitors to face us and said without preamble, "I need to show you something." The document on the screen was a certificate of formation for a limited liability company called Meridian Design Consulting LLC, registered with the California Secretary of State 14 months earlier. The listed business address was a mail forwarding service in Culver City. The listed registered agent was a name I did not recognize. The listed co-founder was Emily Bennett Carter. Emily leaned forward in her chair. Her hand came up and pressed flat against the edge of the table as though she needed something solid to push against. "I've never heard of this company," she said. Her voice was very quiet and very precise, the way voices get when the person using them is working extremely hard to stay functional. "I know," Charles said. He reached across and clicked to the next document. Another certificate of formation. A company called Coastline Advisory Group LLC, registered 8 months earlier, same mail forwarding address in Culver City, different registered agent. Same co-founder, Emily Bennett Carter. 2 companies, Charles said. Both registered in your name as co-founder. Both connected through a chain of subsidiary relationships that took me 4 hours to map last night to the primary revenue operation that Rachel documented on that hard drive. He paused. Both carrying your genuine personal information, your social security number, your home address at the time of registration, your date of birth. All of it accurate. All of it obtained without your knowledge. Emily pushed her chair back from the table and stood up. She did not walk anywhere. There was nowhere to walk in the conference room. She simply stood with her arms wrapped tight across her chest, and her chin dropped, and her breath coming in short, controlled increments that I recognized as the breathing of someone who is managing the distance between composure and the absence of it by the smallest possible margin. "They used everything," she said to the middle distance. "Not just my money, not just my signature. They used my name, my address, my—" She stopped. Her throat worked. "They built things with my identity that I didn't know existed, and they put my name on them, so that if anyone ever looked, they would see me first." "Emily." Charles's voice was careful and deliberate. "I need you to hear what I'm about to say clearly, because it matters legally and it matters practically. Under federal law, criminal liability requires what's called mens rea, a guilty mind. It requires that a person knowingly and willfully participated in the criminal conduct. The forged signatures we have already documented, combined with the fact that you have no record of any involvement with either of these companies, no emails, no phone records, no financial transactions conducted under these company names, establishes that you lacked the knowledge and the intent that federal prosecutors would need to charge you." He held her gaze steadily. "You are a victim of identity fraud, Emily, not a perpetrator. The evidence makes that clear, and I intend to make sure the FBI understands it before they see your name on anything." Emily turned to look at him. Her eyes were red and her jaw was set, and there was something moving in her expression that was too complicated to name. Relief and fury and grief all pressing against each other in the same small space. "They needed someone clean," she said. "Not a question. Yes, Charles said. Someone with a legitimate business and a clean financial history and no prior connections to anything that would raise a flag. Yes. And I was convenient, she said. The word came out sharp enough to cut. 8 years of being convenient, of being useful. And then when that wasn't enough, they decided my name and my identity were convenient too. Her voice broke on the last word, not collapsing, but cracking through the center of it, the way wood cracks under pressure. A clean break that runs along the grain. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stood there for a moment, her shoulders shaking in short, hard pulses. I got up and went to her. I put my arm around her shoulders and felt her lean into it, just slightly, just enough. "We're taking this to the FBI," I said. It was not a question. Charles was already reaching for his phone. "I have an appointment scheduled for Monday morning. Wilshire Boulevard Field Office. I've already spoken with the supervising agent on their financial crimes unit." He looked at Emily over the top of the phone. "I want you to come. Your testimony about the identity theft will be significant." Emily straightened up. She unwrapped her arms from her chest and let them fall to her sides, and she took one long breath that seemed to start somewhere below her ribcage and travel all the way up. "Monday," she said. "I'll be there." She looked at the monitor, still showing the certificate of formation with her name on it. She looked at it for a long time with the fixed, clear-eyed expression of someone memorizing something they intend never to forget. "Print that for me," she said to Charles. Charles looked up. "I want to have it," Emily said. "I want to be able to look at it and remember exactly what they thought I was worth to them." Charles printed it without comment. He folded it in half and slid it across the table. Emily picked it up and put it in her bag with the steadiness of someone who has decided that what they are carrying is not going to be heavier than they can hold. We walked into the FBI field office on Wilshire Boulevard on a Monday morning in late October. Harold Bennett, age 66, carrying a canvas folder with 32 printed pages of bank transfer records, and his daughter Emily, age 34, carrying a portable hard drive and 2 certificates of formation with her name on companies she had never heard of until 4 days ago. The building was the kind of federal architecture that communicates authority without ornamentation, glass, and concrete. American flag out front security checkpoint just inside the lobby that required us to surrender our phones and pass through a scanner before a young agent in a dark suit escorted us to the 4th floor without small talk. Detective Ray Okafor was already in the conference room when we arrived. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with close-cropped hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that the most useful thing you can do in a room full of information is move as little as possible and listen as much as you can. He shook our hands, gestured to the chairs across from him, and opened a fresh legal pad. He did not offer coffee. He did not make introductions beyond his name and his unit. He picked up his pen and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." Charles spoke first, laying out the timeline with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years organizing facts for rooms exactly like this one. Rachel followed, walking Okafor through the contents of the hard drive with the methodical calm of someone who had rehearsed this particular account enough times that the emotion had been worn smooth by repetition, leaving only the facts. Okafor wrote steadily and interrupted rarely, and when he did interrupt, it was with questions so specific they told me he had already done significant background work before we walked through the door. Emily sat beside me and answered every question Okafor directed at her with a steadiness that made my chest ache, with something I could not entirely name, pride, I think, but the complicated kind that comes wrapped in grief because of how much it cost her to be sitting in that room at all. "How long has this operation been running?" Okafor asked Rachel at one point without looking up from his pad. At least 6 years based on what I can document, Rachel said. Probably longer. Okafor wrote something, turned a page, kept writing. 4 hours later, he set his pen down and looked across the table at me for what felt like the first time since we had sat down. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I want to be direct with you. An investigation of this scope, multiple shell companies, multi-state financial activity, potential federal wire fraud charges, moves at a pace that can be frustrating for the people most directly affected by it. We will be thorough. We will be methodical. But thorough and methodical are not the same as fast." I looked at him across the table. "Detective," I said, "I am 66 years old. I have waited longer for less important things." Something moved at the corner of Okafor's mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement of one. "We'll be in touch," he said. Charles and I rode the elevator down together in the kind of quiet that settles between two people who have just done something significant and do not yet need to discuss it. Outside on Wilshire, the October afternoon was warm and bright. Los Angeles entirely indifferent to the contents of the fourth-floor conference room we had just left. Emily stood on the sidewalk with her face turned up toward the sun, her eyes closed, taking a long, slow breath in and out. Her shoulders dropped about half an inch from where they had been for the past 4 hours, and she opened her eyes and looked at me with a tiredness that was different from the tiredness I had been watching accumulate in her for weeks. This tiredness had an end in sight. "Now we wait," Charles said, and reached into his jacket for his phone. He stopped. He looked at the screen. Something in his expression shifted, not alarm exactly, but the specific alertness of a man who has just seen a name he did not expect. "It's Marcus Webb," he said. I looked at him. Richard's partner. The man who stood next to him all evening at the dinner. Charles nodded slowly. His thumb hovered over the screen. "He says he wants to talk." Marcus Webb had stood beside Richard Carter for 22 years. He had helped build Carter Interactive from a 3-person startup in a rented office in Culver City into the glass and steel operation in Century City that employed 400 people and appeared in the business press with reliable frequency. He had shaken hands with every investor Richard had ever brought in, had sat across from every attorney and every auditor and every regulatory examiner, and had said all the right things in all the right rooms for 2 decades, without once, as far as anyone knew, saying anything he hadn't cleared with Richard first. He sat across from me in Charles's conference room 2 days after the FBI meeting and did not offer to shake my hand. "Well, I've been in contact with the Bureau since the night of the dinner," he said. His voice was even and his posture was straight, but his hands on the table were pressed flat in a way that told me he was managing something considerable underneath the surface. "I want you to understand that I made that decision the night it happened, not before. The Bureau spent 3 weeks verifying what I gave them before they were ready to bring in additional witnesses. That's why you didn't hear from them sooner." "What made you decide?" I asked. Marcus looked at me directly. He had the weathered, careful face of the man who had spent a long time being useful to powerful people and had arrived somewhere uncomfortable on the other side of it. "I watched you stand up in that room," he said. "A 66-year-old man with no lawyers present and no plan beyond what was right. And I drove home that night, and I sat in my driveway for 40 minutes. And I thought about 22 years of things I had seen and not reported, and I called the Bureau at 11 o'clock. Charles leaned forward. "What did you provide them?" "The server passwords," Marcus said. "The internal admin credentials for Carter Interactive's primary data infrastructure. Without those, the Bureau could seize the hardware, but the relevant data was encrypted behind a secondary authentication system that Richard implemented 18 months ago, specifically because he had begun to worry about exposure. He paused. With the passwords, everything is accessible. Every transfer record, every communication, every file, and every subsidiary account going back to the beginning. The room was very quiet for a moment. "You'll face charges yourself," Charles said. It was not a question. "I've entered into a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office," Marcus said. "I will be charged. I will likely serve time. I accepted that when I made the call." He said it without self-pity and without performance, in the flat tone of a man reading the terms of a contract he had negotiated with his eyes open. "I'm not here asking for your sympathy, Mr. Bennett. I'm here because I thought you should know that what you did at that dinner started something. And I wanted to look at the man who started it." 3 days later, at 6 o'clock on a Monday morning, I was standing in my kitchen in Pasadena making coffee when my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Charles. 7 words. "It's done. Turn on the news. Call me." I turned on the television in the living room. The local news was already running the footage aerial shots of Century City, a line of dark SUVs outside the Carter Interactive building, agents in FBI windbreakers carrying boxes through the lobbied doors. A second location, the gates of the Bel Air estate standing open for the first time I had ever seen them, 2 patrol cars angled across the driveway. The anchor's voice described simultaneous search warrants executed at 6 separate locations across Los Angeles County. Computer servers and financial records seized. The founder and CEO of Carter Interactive taken into custody at his residence for questioning in connection with federal fraud and money laundering charges. Richard Carter, age 68, of Bel Air. I set my coffee down on the counter. I looked at the photograph of Dorothy on the shelf above the counter, the one from Tommy's first birthday, where she was laughing at something out of frame with her whole face. My phone rang. It was Charles. "Richard's been arrested," he said. "Daniel's attorney contacted the bureau this morning. He'll surrender voluntarily this afternoon at the Wilshire office." A pause. "It's done, Harold." I stood in my kitchen in Pasadena with the television still running and my coffee going cold, and the October morning coming through the window, and I pressed my hand flat against the counter to make sure I was still standing on something solid. "Call Emily," I said. "Already did," Charles said. "She's on her way to you." The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in April. 6 months had passed since the dinner at Bel Air. 6 months of legal filings and FBI interviews and financial disclosures and custody evaluations and all the other machinery that the law requires before it will formally acknowledge that a marriage is over. Emily had moved through all of it with the focused, methodical energy of someone who had decided that the only direction available was forward, and I had watched her come back to herself in increments so gradual they were only visible when I compared the woman sitting across from me now to the woman who had knocked on my door at 2 in the morning, with her arms wrapped around her own chest. She wore a gray dress she had bought herself the week before. Not for anyone else, just because she liked the color. Los Angeles County Superior Court was a building that had processed enough human grief and conflict and resolution over its decades of operation that it seemed to have absorbed some quality of all of it, a weight in the corridors, a specific quality of light in the courtroom that was neither harsh nor forgiving, but simply present the way a witness is present. I sat in the first row behind the bar, directly behind Emily's chair. I did not look at Daniel when he came in. I looked at the back of my daughter's head and the set of her shoulders and the way she held her hands folded on the table in front of her, steady, deliberate belonging entirely to herself. Judge Sandra Holloway entered at 9:03, and the room rose and settled with the practiced choreography of people who had done this before. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she moved through the preliminary record-keeping with the efficient, unhurried authority of someone who had presided over enough of these proceedings to understand exactly what they cost the people sitting in them. Daniel's attorney spoke first. His client had acted under significant familial pressure. His client had not been the primary architect of the financial irregularities. His client expressed genuine remorse and requested the court's consideration of his cooperation with federal prosecutors in the parallel criminal matter. Judge Holloway listened without expression, her pen moving occasionally across the papers in front of her. Then she looked at Daniel. "Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice was measured and entirely without drama. "I have a few questions for you directly." Daniel's attorney rose immediately, this time his voice careful and controlled. "Your Honor, given the active federal proceedings involving my client, I've advised him to invoke his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent on any questions that may intersect with those criminal matters. We ask the court's understanding." Judge Holloway looked at the attorney for a moment. Then she looked back at Daniel. "Understood," she said. "The court will note that responses were withheld, and the court will draw its own conclusions accordingly." She picked up her pen. "I'll ask anyway for the record. Did you know that your wife's signature had been forged on financial authorization documents?" Daniel's jaw tightened. His hands on the table pressed together. He said nothing. "Mr. Carter, did you know that $310,000 was transferred out of accounts your wife contributed to without her knowledge or consent?" The courtroom was absolutely still. I could hear the ventilation system running somewhere above the ceiling panels. Daniel pressed his lips together. His eyes went to his attorney, who gave him a look that meant something I couldn't read from where I was sitting. He said nothing. "Mr. Carter." Judge Holloway set her pen down. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Were you aware that your wife's name and personal identifying information had been used to register companies connected to a federal fraud investigation?" The third silence was the heaviest of the three. Judge Holloway picked up her pen again. She looked at Daniel for a moment longer, not with anger, not with contempt, but with the particular expression of someone who has received the answer they were expecting and finds no satisfaction in having been right. "The silence of this court, Mr. Carter, is different from yours," she said. "Yours was a choice made over 8 years. This court's ruling is also a choice, and it will be considerably louder." Behind me, I heard someone shift in their seat. In front of me, Emily's shoulders rose with one slow breath and then dropped, and she lifted her chin just slightly, and I watched her do it and felt something release in my own chest that had been held tight since September. When the session concluded and people began to gather their things, Daniel said her name. "Emily." She was already standing, already reaching for her bag. She stopped at the sound of her name, one beat too, and I watched her make the decision. I had watched her make at the door of the Bel Air estate 6 months earlier. The same decision arrived at the same way, quietly and completely. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door, and I fell into step beside her, and we walked out of that courtroom together into the wide, indifferent brightness of an April morning in Los Angeles. "Is it really over?" she asked on the courthouse steps. "The hard part is," I said. She took a breath of the outside air, sharp and fresh after the recycled stillness of the courtroom, and for just a moment she closed her eyes and turned her face toward the sun, the way I had watched her do on the sidewalk outside the FBI building 6 months ago. Then she opened them. "Let's go home," she said. Judge Holloway's ruling came through on a gray Thursday afternoon in late April, 6 months and 3 weeks since the night of the dinner, give or take a few days. I had stopped counting. Charles read it to me over the phone while I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store in Pasadena, engine off, watching a woman struggle to fold a stroller one-handed while her toddler pulled at her jacket sleeve, entirely indifferent to the fact that somewhere on the 14th floor of a courthouse in downtown Los Angeles, a judge had just decided the shape of my daughter's future. Primary custody of Tommy to Emily, Charles said. Daniel receives structured visitation supervised initially pending the outcome of the parallel criminal proceedings. A pause while he turned a page. Full restitution of $310,000 ordered as a civil judgment. This is separate from any criminal restitution the federal court may impose in the fraud case. The civil judgment stands regardless of the criminal outcome. The house, I asked. We sold. Emily receives 63% of net proceeds calculated against her documented financial contributions to the purchase and subsequent renovation costs. Another page. Her name has been formally removed from both shell company registrations. The court accepted the forensic signature evidence and the FBI's confirmation of identity fraud. As of today, Meridian Design Consulting and Coastline Advisory Group have no legal connection to Emily Bennett. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, the woman had finally conquered the stroller. Her toddler was now attempting to climb into the grocery cart. She caught him with one arm without breaking stride, and I thought watching her about all the things women manage simultaneously that nobody ever thinks to count. Richard, I asked. Federal plea agreement accepted last week, Charles said. He'll be sentenced under federal guidelines. The cooperation agreement means reduced charges, but reduced is not dismissed. He's looking at significant time. A pause. Margaret's assets remain frozen pending the conclusion of her own investigation. Carter Interactive filed for bankruptcy protection in July 3 months from now, if they last that long. The company as it existed is finished. Daniel, Charles took a breath. His criminal sentencing is separate and still pending. The civil judgment stands independently. He'll be paying Emily back for a long time. I thanked Charles and sat in the car for a while longer after he hung up. The parking lot moved around me in its ordinary Thursday rhythms. Cars pulling in and out. A teenager collecting shopping carts in a slow, diagonal arc across the asphalt. An older man sitting on a bench near the entrance, eating something from a paper bag with the unhurried contentment of someone who had nowhere pressing to be. I thought about a Saturday morning 8 years ago, when Emily had called me from a garden in Pasadena to say she had something to tell me, and she had been laughing before she even started talking, and I had stood in my kitchen holding the phone with both hands, because her laugh had sounded so purely like itself that I had wanted to hold on to it. I thought about Dorothy saying very quietly at the kitchen table one evening, "I think she's not telling us everything, Harold. I think that family is harder than she's letting on." I thought about all the things I should have said then and did not. My phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Charles called me. "I'm at the office. Come see." I drove to Santa Monica. The office was a single room on the second floor of a building 2 blocks from the water with large windows that let in the kind of afternoon light that made everything look slightly more hopeful than it had an hour ago. Claire Collins was standing on a step stool hanging something on the wall when I came in, a large architectural print, clean lines beautifully framed. Emily was below her holding it level, calling out small adjustments. Left. No back right. Stop. Perfect. Claire climbed down, and they both stood back and looked at it. "That's the one," Claire said, with the satisfaction of someone completing a thing that has been waiting to be completed. Emily turned when she heard me come through the door. She looked at my face, and I looked at hers, and what I saw there was not the exhausted, careful composure I had watched her maintain for 6 months, or the cold fury of the weeks after the dinner, or the grief of the kitchen in Pasadena at 2 in the morning. She looked like herself, The version of herself that existed before she learned to make herself small. Her eyes filled up fast, and she pressed her lips together hard, and then gave up on that entirely, and crossed the room and hugged me. And I held my daughter in a room full of afternoon light, 2 blocks from the Pacific Ocean, and I felt her shoulders shaking against me. And this time, the shaking was different. This time it was relief all the way down. "Your mother would have been so proud of you today," I said into her hair. Emily pulled back and looked at me with her wet eyes and her unguarded face, and she laughed a real laugh, full and startled and entirely her own. "She would have said I took too long," she said. "She would have," I agreed. "And she would have been wrong. A year moves differently when you are rebuilding." By September of 2024, 12 months after the dinner at Bel Air, the months between April and September had collapsed into each other in a way that still surprises me when I try to account for them. Emily's office in Santa Monica smelled like coffee and fresh paint for most of the summer. I drove out there on a Thursday afternoon in August and found her and Claire Collins bent over a drafting table covered in fabric samples and floor plan sketches, arguing cheerfully about the load-bearing implications of a wall removal in a house in Brentwood, whose owners had apparently changed their minds 3 times in 2 weeks. "They want to open the kitchen to the living room," Claire said without looking up. "But they also want to keep the original 1920s character, which means we find a solution that does both," Emily said, already reaching for a pencil. "That's literally what they're paying us for." Claire looked up at me over Emily's bent head and grinned. "She's been like this since April," she said. "It's exhausting and wonderful." Emily straightened up and saw me, and her face did the thing it had been doing since April, opening up the way a room opens up when someone pulls back the curtains and lets the light in. She crossed to me and hugged me the way she had started hugging me since the courthouse, like she meant it all the way through and was not counting the seconds. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said. "I was in the neighborhood," I said. "You live 40 minutes away." "I was in the neighborhood," I said again. She laughed. On the last Sunday of September, the anniversary of the dinner at Bel Air arrived and passed without ceremony, which was exactly the right way for it to pass. Emily came to Pasadena with Tommy, and we made the meal Dorothy used to make on the first cool Sunday of every autumn: roast chicken, wild rice, the apple cake that required more effort than it appeared to. Tommy stood on a step stool at the counter beside me and took his role as official apple peeler with the gravity of someone performing surgery. "Grandpa," he said, concentrating hard on the peeler, "did you know my mom cried at her office last week?" I glanced at Emily across the kitchen. She was stirring something on the stove and her shoulders were shaking with suppressed laughter. "Did she?" I said. Claire said it was because a client told her the living room was exactly what she had always imagined. Tommy looked up at me with the earnest bewilderment of an 8-year-old confronting adult behavior. "Why would someone cry about that?" Emily turned from the stove. Her eyes were bright, and her cheeks were flushed from the heat, and she looked so entirely like herself, the self she had been before 8 years of careful diminishment, that my chest tightened with something that was not sadness, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Because sometimes," she said, "something turns out exactly the way you hoped it would. And when you've spent a long time not expecting that, it catches you off guard." Tommy considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he went back to his apple. After dinner, Emily and Tommy drove home to their apartment in Pasadena, 3 blocks from my house, close enough that Tommy could ride his bike over on weekend mornings, which he did with a reliability that made me feel wealthy in the way that actually matters. I stood on the front porch after their taillights disappeared around the corner and looked up at the sky over Pasadena. The particular dark blue of a September evening, the kind Dorothy used to say was her favorite color in the world. because it only lasted about 20 minutes, and you had to be paying attention to catch it. I had been paying attention. Daniel sent Emily a letter in January of 2025, 16 months after the dinner, 6 months after the divorce was finalized. She brought it to Pasadena on a Sunday afternoon, still sealed, and set it on my kitchen table between us the way you set down something you are not sure you want to open alone. "Do you want me to leave?" I asked. "No," she said. "Stay." She opened it. She read it standing up, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed and her eyes moving steadily down the page. When she finished, she folded it in thirds, set it on the table, and looked out the window at the lemon tree Dorothy had planted in the backyard. "He says he's sorry," she said. "That he was afraid of his father his whole life. That he never wanted to hurt me." She paused. "He probably means all of it." "But," I said. She looked at me, and her eyes were dry, and her voice was even, and she looked like a woman who had finished grieving something and arrived at the quiet on the other side of it. "I waited 8 years for him to say something that mattered when it could have changed things," she said. "This is too late to be anything other than what it is." She picked up the letter and put it in her bag. Not in the trash. In her bag. I understood the difference. She was not angry anymore. She was simply done. I thought about Richard Carter somewhere in a federal facility, working through the early months of a sentence that would last considerably longer than anything he had planned for. I thought about Margaret in a rental apartment, far from the estate in Bel Air, far from the life she had spent decades constructing. I thought about Marcus Webb facing his own reduced but real consequences, living with the knowledge that 22 years of silence had cost him everything he had built during them. I thought about Carter Interactive, the glass and steel building in Century City, the 400 employees who had dispersed to other companies and other lives, the server rooms that had held all of it and now held nothing. Gone. All of it gone. Tommy came running in from the backyard, with dirt on both knees and a stick he had apparently decided was important. And he skidded to a stop at the kitchen door and looked between Emily and me with the radar children have for the emotional temperature of a room. "Is everything okay?" he asked. Emily pushed off from the counter and crossed to him and crouched down so she was at his level. She took the important stick from his hand and looked at it with the seriousness it deserved. "Everything is okay, baby," she said. "Everything is really okay." Tommy studied her face for it, with those clear, dark eyes that saw more than most adults credited him for. Then he nodded, satisfied, took his stick back, and ran back out into the yard. Emily stood up. She looked at me across the kitchen, and for a moment neither of us needed to say anything because 34 years of being her father and 66 years of being alive in the world had given us a language that did not always require words. Then she smiled, the full, unguarded smile I had been waiting to see since before Dorothy died, the one that belonged entirely to her and to no one else. "Come outside," she said. "Tommy found something in the yard, and I think it requires your professional opinion." I followed my daughter out into the January afternoon, into the backyard, where the lemon tree was bare, and the grass was winter pale, and Tommy was crouching over something in the dirt with the intensity of a scientist on the edge of a discovery. Richard Carter had thrown a piece of steak at my daughter to remind her of her place. He did not know that the moment he did it, he showed us all exactly where his was. And standing in my backyard in Pasadena, on a quiet January afternoon, watching my grandson crouch in the dirt and my daughter walk toward him through the winter light, I understood something I had not had the words for until now. Her place had never been at anyone else's table. It had always been here. People ask me what I learned from all of this. Family Stories Revenge is never loud. It is a 66-year-old man with a phone standing up in a room when standing up is the only right thing left to do. I was not a perfect father. I saw the signs and looked away. So if you take one thing from this family drama revenge, do not wait the way I waited. Do not tell yourself the person you love is strong enough to carry it alone. Strength was never meant to be carried in silence. I believe God places people in our lives not to watch us fall, but to be the hands that catch us when we do. My honest opinion, Family Stories Revenge is not about settling scores. It is about refusing to let the people you love disappear into someone else's idea of who they should be. And sometimes, family drama revenge begins with something as simple as standing up at a dinner table and making one phone call. If this story reached your heart, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories on this channel include fictional elements built for reflection and entertainment. If this content is not for you, we respect that completely. Step away and find what speaks to you.